Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another session of ILA Dialogues. Today, we have with us Advocate Vaishali Bhagwat. Vaishali ma'am is among the first technology lawyers in the country with prior qualification and working experience in the field of computer science, cyber defense, and information assurance. She earned a degree in computer science and law from Pune University and a postgraduate certification in cybersecurity and information assurance from Cranfield University, UK. She has an experience of over 20 years as a practicing lawyer in civil and cyber law. Welcome, ma'am. Today, Vaishali ma'am will be speaking about living wills.
Thank you, Sudisha. Do you want me to start?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So thank you, ILA, Sudisha, Jamshed, for giving me this opportunity. There's a little backstory to why this session on living wills, and let me give you the backstory first before I get into the presentation. I have prepared a small presentation so that it's for the benefit of all the members, where I've listed down the procedure. So whoever later on wants to file an application to take registration to register a living will, they can refer to the presentation at a later stage. So my firm or my law office, we could register the first living will, if I can say, for the whole of Maharashtra. I'm not very sure, but I can definitely say for the Pune district. Why it is also possible that it could be the first in the state of Maharashtra, because when I filed that application before the jurisdictional JMFC, we did face a lot of issues relating to procedure, because almost no one had a clue about what we were talking about. And after going to the jurisdictional JMFC, since things did not move ahead, I actually had to approach the district judge with an application saying that you need to designate a JMFC who will look into these matters, which are specialized matters. And that is how the correspondence with the High Court happened between the High Court and the Pune district, with an office order for appointment of a designated judge. And then that is how things moved ahead. Though a registration of a living will should not take a large amount of time, this particular one did, as I said, because the procedure was not established, but now it is. So that's the good news. Now, at least in Pune, the registrar knows what is to be done, which is the designated JMFC who will go through the process and eventually look at whether this living will needs to be countersigned by that particular JMFC or not. Fortunately, the judicial magistrate who was in charge of these proceedings also was very keen on doing it, as it was something new, something to learn for everyone. And we had a wonderful time going through the entire judgment, trying to analyze it and see to it that effect is given to what is the essence of the judgment that was laid down by the Supreme Court in 2018 between the parties of Common Cause versus the Union of India. This judgment was passed in March 2018, making advance directives now legal or valid in India, and even passive euthanasia valid in India. As you all know, that otherwise the right to die or suicide or assisted suicide or abetment of suicide are these provisions under IPC, which make assisted suicide a criminal offense. So with this background, I'm going to share my screen so that that small presentation will come up. So Disha, just let me know if this is visible so that I can proceed.
It's visible, ma'am.
So just to again give a background of how I started doing this work, because I think my introduction was all about cybersecurity and cyber safety, which definitely is a part of my practice, or the practice that I do from my law firm, VP Shindre and Associates. However, since we are civil litigation lawyers, civil litigation has been part of my practice for several years. And a few years back, say about 8 to 9 years back, my father, Mr. VP Shindre, wrote a book on how to make wills in Marathi as well as English. And it was very well received because it was written in very simple language, and for the common man to understand the nuances of preparation of a will, and also so that the dependence on lawyers to make a will also reduces, because it's not really necessary if you are in the right frame of mind, and also write the will down in simple sentences and maybe just go to the lawyer to review the will. It was very well received, not only in the public, but even in the legal fraternity, because he had made the law of succession look so simple. You know, otherwise we all know that we struggled with sections under the Indian Succession Act or the Hindu Succession Act, and to be able to translate that as to how the law of succession can be in a way sidelined by having a will, and then opening up succession as per your own choice or your own desire. It was stated in such a simple form that I learned a lot from that book, and I used to give a lot of lectures on how to make a will as in my pro bono activity in lot many forums. That is why when the decision of the living will came, we had a lot of inquiries in our office itself as to what is it and how can we do it, should be part of our estate management and all of that. So understanding the judgment became imperative, and also the nuanced differences between passive euthanasia, living will, and how to really draft one. So right at the basis, let me say that living will is something that is going to come in operation while the person is alive, and the other will, which is in respect of disposition of property, is going to come in effect after the person dies. So that's the very basic difference of, though the word that is used is will, and that is why I thought this clarity should come right at the beginning. Though it says a will, living will has nothing to do with property. The living will has to do with your life, or the living will talk about the quality of life that you want to spend, and it has nothing to do with your property, either movable or immovable. So through the session, I thought this is what I will cover. I think I spoke already a little bit about will and succession. So let's talk about the law. Let's talk about what the salient features of the advance directive are. Let's also speak about the preparation of the advance directive itself and what it should contain, what it should not contain. Then there is a role of the medical board when it comes to not only preparation of the advance directive, but also recording and preservation and implementation and execution of the advance directive. So let's try and find out what the role of the medical board is. And a very important provision would be about revocation or inapplicability of the advance directive. And what happens when there is no advance directive? You have a patient in a vegetative state or in a terminally in condition. Has the Supreme Court also looked at this aspect of human life when that person has not been able to make an advance directive? So even that is part of the judgment. Now again, is there a law that has been notified around advanced medical directive or around advanced or around living will? The answer is no. The Supreme Court has not only laid down the law in 2018, but also has laid down very detailed and express procedure as to how it is done. And in one of the observations, the Supreme Court also says as to why this is enough and no particular law will be necessary. And maybe in some time, I will also read out from certain paragraphs of the judgment. In fact, let me read that out right away so that it puts in context as to why a separate law is not necessary. Maybe I'll give out certain paragraphs. It's a 256-page judgment. So maybe I'll give out some page numbers and paragraph numbers which are not there on the slide. So if maybe since it's recorded, it will be of use. I'm reading out from page 47, para 144. it says that we are required to advert to the issue whether passive euthanasia can only be conceived through legislation of this court, or this court can for present provide for the same. We have already explained that the ratio laid down in Gyan Kaur does not convey that the introduction of passive euthanasia can only be by legislation. In Aruna Shanbag, the two-judge bench has placed reliance on the Constitution Bench judgment in Gyan Kaur to lay down the guidelines. If eventually we arrive at a conclusion that passive euthanasia comes within the sweep of Article 21 of the Constitution, we have no iota of doubt that this court can lay down the guidelines, which the court eventually did. The guidelines which have been laid down in the Supreme Court judgment given in 2018. So before we come to this judgment of 2018, just let's look at how the background for this judgment was laid down earlier. So I'm going to refer to four judgments again of the Supreme Court, and the first one was P. Rathinam versus the Union of India. It did not talk directly about euthanasia, passive euthanasia, advanced medical directive, or living will, but it did talk about an analogy that the way the freedom of speech and expression includes the freedom of keeping silent, if I may say so, that this was an analogy which was drawn in that judgment, and it said that wherein the question of unconstitutionality of section 309 of the IPC arose, and an analogy with freedom of speech and expression was made, where it was held that the freedom of speech and expression includes the freedom not to speak. A similar corollary was also drawn for the other fundamental rights as well, including Article 21, that is the right to life, and it was held that logically it must follow that the right to live would include the right not to live, that is the right to die or to terminate one's life. This was just a passing reference that was made, but this actually started the conversation about whether the right to die with dignity is enshrined in the right to life itself. So after this came the Srimati Gyan Kaur versus State of Punjab judgment, where this was regarding specifically about unconstitutionality of section 306 of IPC, which is abetment to suicide. A wonderful observation was made there relating to what is death and what is passive euthanasia. And again, as I said, the foundation for passive euthanasia was laid, or euthanasia was laid down in this judgment of Srimati Gyan Kaur. And again, I'm going to read. It held that suicide is an unnatural termination of life, therefore incompatible and inconsistent with the concept of right to life. The court further held that the comparison of right to life and other rights is not apt because they differ greatly in nature. However, it went ahead and stated that, and this is what the Common Cause judgment has referred to, this paragraph of the Gyan Kaur judgment, which forms the basis of how it has been established that now passive euthanasia in India is legal, while active euthanasia remains illegal. A question may arise in the context of a dying man who is terminally ill or in a persistent vegetative state, that he may be permitted to terminate it by premature extinction of his life in those circumstances. These category of cases may fall within the ambit of the right to die with dignity as a part of right to live with dignity, when death due to termination of natural life is certain and imminent. The process of natural death has commenced. This is important, that already the person is at such a state that the termination of natural life is certain and imminent, and the process of natural death has commenced. These are not cases of extinguishing life, but only of accelerating conclusion of the process of natural death, which has already commenced. The debate, even in such cases, to permit physician-assisted termination of life is inconclusive, remained inconclusive in that judgment. However, this few lines which I've just quoted from the judgment were used in the judgment given by the Constitutional Bench in 2018, saying that persons who are in a persistent vegetative state or persons who are terminally ill, if they choose to die with dignity, that has to be upheld as the process of death has already started. All that will be happening will be acceleration of this process by the choice the person has expressed either in their advanced medical directive or whatever the medical board eventually may conclude, which could be termed as passive euthanasia. This concept of passive euthanasia again came to the fore in the Aruna Shanbag judgment, and we all are very familiar with what happened and the kind of torture the patient Aruna Shanbag went through because she was on life support for several years, and almost the treatment was cruel and did not do anything to elevate her the dignity of her life. In the Aruna Shanbag judgment, the Supreme Court very specifically allowed passive euthanasia and held that the Constitution Bench in Gyancore did not express any binding opinion with respect to passive euthanasia and reiterated its understanding of the above case as follows. It was held in Gyancore that there is no right to die under Article 21 of the Constitution, and the right to life includes the right to live with human dignity. But in the case of a dying person who is terminally ill or in a permanent vegetative state, he may be allowed a premature extinction of his life, and it would not amount to a crime. So now we came to a stage by the judgment in Aruna Shanbag that if life support is withdrawn from a patient who is in a terminally ill condition or in a vegetative state and also is unable to express an opinion whether that person would want to continue with a certain medical treatment or not, then it is permitted, of course, with the right procedures in place, which Aruna Shanbag judgment laid down, that if there is permission from the High Court, which has now changed in the Common Cause judgment, but at that time, if the High Court permits, after due diligence, that yes, the person is in a vegetative state or is in a terminally ill condition and unable to take decision for himself or herself, then it is legal to remove life support to such patients, which is termed as passive euthanasia, and that will not amount to a crime. So it was brought out of the ambit of what Section 306 of IPC has been saying. Later on, in the judgment given again by the Constitutional Bench in the Common Cause versus Union of India, where the NGO had filed a PIL seeking 3 reliefs. The first relief was about the constitutionality of 306 itself. The second relief was more particularly about making passive euthanasia legal by certain directions and passing of a law. And the third was about having procedures in place relating to the advanced medical directive. And as I said, today's session is on the third point, the third relief that was sought in that judgment. That is, what is the procedure that has been laid down by the Supreme Court for the advanced medical directive. Now, why have I really given this background is, it is very important for even us as lawyers to understand, because the client is going to come to you while he's in a mentally fit condition to prepare a medical will or to prepare what we call as the living will or the advanced medical directive. So all these basic concepts of choosing the right treatment, saying no to the medical treatment, saying yes to a particular treatment, trying to understand what his current medical condition is, all would have to be considered while making the draft. Registration of the living will come much later, but prior to that, the client is going to come to you seeking help that I've heard about this or I've read about the judgment, or I say read something in the newspaper, or this is something that I wanted to do for the longest period of time. I want to choose the medical treatment that I want to avail of when I may not be in a position to decide what sort of medical treatment is good or bad for me. So I want to do that like way ahead. And that is why the word advance directive means something that you write today and which is going to be implemented much later. So these principles, or understanding these very basic principles on what passive euthanasia means, what is the right to make choices about the possible medical treatment your client would want, is an absolute must. What we do is, for the clients that we have drafted these medical wills or the advance directives, we also have a consultation with either their treating physicians or family doctors to understand their present medical condition, one, and also consult experts in this field or medical doctors. Fortunately, I have a few doctors in my family self, where we try and analyze what sort of medical treatment what that person would want or the person would not want. We also encourage the client to go to have a consultation with their own doctors to come up with a list of treatments that one would want to avail or not want to avail, because that clarity is an absolute essential ingredient when it comes to not only drafting but finalizing of the advance directive. And eventually when we go to court and the court is going to ask questions to the executor as to how have you decided to include all these following conditions in the will. So that's I think that from the practical aspect, this is something that is really need to be considered. So let's look at the meaning and the concept of this advanced medical directive. According to the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics, an advance directive or a living will is a document prepared by a person to instruct doctors and caregivers what must be done and not done if and when the person is no longer able to take decisions on his own health on account of illness or incapacity. So the instructions are being given to the doctors. So the instructions also need to be very clear, very precise, and also that also would include medical terminology for the doctors to absolutely understand what is meant by those instructions. This document, and we've been talking about the importance about this document all through, but the most significant part of this document is that this person making such a will now has been given the right to choose to live a life of dignity and to maintain the quality of life, and choose not to have certain medical treatments which may just tantamount to prolonging of the life without ensuring the quality of life. Like any other will that you would have prepared, the salient features would be that this will has to be in writing. It cannot be, and following this due process. So it cannot be over email. It cannot be done orally. It cannot be written down just on a piece of paper. There are a lot of further procedures that need to be followed. But where does it start with? By writing it down. Voluntary, without any coercion, without any inducement, without any compulsion, and when the person is in a fit state of mind. I really need not elaborate on any of these, but we all know these would be the basis or the foundation on which the advance medical directive is prepared. When the executor whose will we got registered in the Pune court was put in the witness box and the JMFC was asking her questions, one of the questions the JMFC did ask her was, were you pressurized in writing this document down? And she just simply smiled and said, no ma'am, I'm not the person who can be pressurized by anybody. So it was a nice light moment in the court. But it's very important that the person who's writing this down is absolutely sure of what is being written down. As I said, the advance directive is not to be confused with a will, which is about testamentary succession. So the will that disposes of movable and immovable property of the testator. So this advance directive cannot be coupled with that will. These are two separate documents and they cannot be tied together in any manner. AD becomes operational while the person is still alive. So at best, the advance directive could contain clauses for organ donation. That may come in the advance directive, though the organ donation may happen while the person is breathing or after the death of the person, but that can be included in the advance directive. Who can execute? An adult, we all know, sound mind, we all know. What is also important is someone who is able to communicate, relate, and comprehend the purpose and consequences of executing the document. Now, in this presentation, I have not given any draft of the living will, but why have I put these points here? Because while drafting, this is what should come out from your draft, or this is what should come out from the way you've written the will for the client, where it is very obvious that the client is able to communicate very clearly what he or she wants, is able to comprehend what is written in that advance directive, and also be able to understand fully well the consequences of executing the document. Because it may happen that the executor may want to change the advance directive after a few years, because medical science is advancing by leaps and bounds. So today one may feel, oh, I don't want this sort of treatment, but after 5 years, one may feel that no, it is important that I get this treatment because my chances of survival and regaining my quality of life are much higher because of the advancements in medical technology or the medical profession. So it is important that the executor has understood exactly what the medical terminology you may want to use while drafting the advance directive. What it should contain: clearly mention the circumstances in which withholding or withdrawal of medical treatment can be resorted to. Now, I can this is my advice, that this can be written properly and clearly only when there is some sort of assistance that you've got from a doctor in terms of actually listing down the medical treatment that one can resort to or cannot or doesn't want to resort to. I've already spoken about intention of organ donation, and it's also important that you name the organs. I have made some living wills in which people have donated their entire there has been Dehadan, or the body has been donated to medical colleges. So it is also important that you name the institutions where the executor would want to donate the organs or the body. And there are also organ donation registrations that these institutions allow. So it could also be of help that such registrations are done prior, and the registration details are also mentioned in the living will, so that it becomes very easy for organ harvesting, because every minute is important when the organ needs to be harvested. So if it's all in one document, that makes it easier for everybody, the relatives, the executor of the will or of the advance directive, and also the doctors. Now here I'm using the word executor also in place of the testator. That is because that is how the Supreme Court judgment has mentioned. So the person making the advance directive is also referred to as the executor. But there is also another executor which is named in the will who will execute that advance directive. So sometimes, we are using this word interchangeably. We know that for the other will that we prepare, we generally use the terminology as the testator and the executor. Another interesting thing that you can include is, a lot of people do have these questions that actually I would like to, a person may say, no, actually I would like to live on forever, even if it is under medical support, but I know my finances are limited and I don't want to burden my relatives or my children who would want to then spend on my medical, would support the medical bills. So the executor can also define the source of funds to meet these medical expenses in this living will. And I think that that's a very interesting clause that you can insert in the advance directives that you would prepare. As I had earlier said, it is very important that in the drafting itself, you are able to convey that the executor has understood the content and the consequences of what is going to happen in the will, and all the other drafting rules that we follow for the normal will, if I can call that. Be clear, be concise, use small statements, do not repeat. Repetition generally causes more confusion than clarity. So if you want to say something, just say it once in a small statement. Do not try to prove how good your English is in that document. Keep that English simple, which can be understood by everybody, and small sentences with proper full stops and commas, and most of the times it will work. It is also important that in the content, the name of the guardian or a close relative is mentioned, who will be authorized to give consent to refuse or withdraw medical treatment in the manner which is consistent with the AD. So this person you may refer to as the executor as well. So the person who is named in the advance directive, who is eventually going to take decisions. Now, one more difference between the will and the advance directive is that in the will, generally the beneficiaries need not know what is the content of the will. So the near relatives, children need not know what is written in the will. The witnesses also need not know what is written in the will. In fact, I always tell my clients it's not necessary. Sometimes children get their parents saying that, oh, they want to make a will, but I just drive them away saying that, no, you have no business. It is the parents who will decide. It is the person who owns the property will decide who the property will go to. And you are not going to sit next to him telling him what is good and bad for him. But in this case, it is very important that the close relatives are mentioned in the will. The close relatives know the contents of the will, and the witnesses also know contents of the will, because all of them are going to be examined by the JMFC later on when the will is recorded and countersigned by the JMFC. So that's a big difference between how these two drafts are prepared. Do I need to pause here if you have any questions, or is it like too much of a monologue for me also? So Disha, could you just give me some feedback? Is this going okay? Do you have any questions?
No, ma'am, I don't have any questions right now. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask, ma'am.
Okay, so till people think of questions, let me go ahead. So now we have reached a stage where we have, whether your client has understood what it really means. We've also prepared the document which is called the advance directive. As a lawyer, you have considered all the directions which have been given down in the judgment of the Supreme Court given in 2018 as to how the advance directive has to be prepared. Now the question is, all the signatures have happened. Now the question is, can it be executed as it is? The answer is no, it cannot be executed as it is. now you have to present that document to the jurisdictional JMFC for a counter signature, because that is the procedure which has been laid down in that judgment. So the document has to be signed by the executor in the presence of two attesting witnesses. The witnesses have to be near relatives, the near relatives. The witnesses should be aware and conversant with the contents of the AD. And then you need to present it for the counter signature of the JMFC. That JMFC court is the one who is designated. So it is not jurisdictional JMFC. That is what we did when we filed our first application. We went to the jurisdictional JMFC, and since that JMFC had no clue of what to do with this application, neither did the registrar, though we got it numbered as a MA. Then because of an administrative order given by the district judge, now there is a designated JMFC who will do this. Another very important part of the role of the witness on this advance directive is that even the witnesses should record their satisfaction before signing on that advance directive that the executor is in a fit state of mind and has made the document voluntarily without any coercion or inducement or compulsion. So there is an additional responsibility given on the witness. So the witness is not just about, I know this person and I know this signature. The witness is going to certify that when he executed this AD, the executor was in a fit state, and I can certify that. He's done it voluntary, the consent was free without any coercion, etc. And that he is also aware of the content of the will. Before making the counter signature, the judgment says that the JMFC shall record its satisfaction that the executor is in a fit state of mind and has made the document voluntarily without any coercion, inducement, or compulsion. In the procedure that we followed, in order to enable the JMFC to record its satisfaction, we examined the executor of the advance directive, the person making that advance directive. We examined the doctor who had given a certificate of fitness of the executor. We examined both the attesting witnesses to enable JMFC to record its satisfaction. It's not written down in the judgment as to how the JMFC would do that, but this is the procedure that we follow. Now, once that is done, once the designated JMFC court states that, yes, I'm satisfied that all the conditions laid down in the Supreme Court judgment has been satisfied, and the executor has understood the contents of the will, and I am satisfied that he or she has done it by understanding the content as well as the consequences, I am putting my signature on the will. So now on the advance directive, you have the signature of the executor, the signature of the two witnesses, and you also have the signature of the JMFC. Then what happens to the document? Now we're talking of the preservation of that document. So who all will have copies? The JMFC will have one copy. The JMFC will send one copy to the registrar of the district court. The registrar as well as the JMFC will preserve these copies also in a digital format. The JMFC will inform all immediate family members of the executor. One copy will be given to the municipal corporation, municipality, or the local government. And one copy also will be given to the family physician. So many copies are now in circulation. Now this is done. Now you have registered the JMFC as countersigned, and you can just forget about this proceeding. Now, when will this advance directive come into effect? Only when the executor becomes terminally ill, or the executor is undergoing a prolonged medical treatment with no hope of recovery or cure of ailment. So only under these two conditions, only then that advance directive is going to come into effect, not in any other circumstances, because any other circumstances would mean active euthanasia. So now who can give effect to the advance directive? So let us say either of these two conditions have been satisfied, and the relatives and the doctor decide to check whether there is an advance directive and what is stated in the advance directive. So the doctor will first inspect the document and ascertain that it is genuine and it is authentic, and then present it to the JMFC to check whether all these registration procedures have been followed or not. So there would be a reference made to the JMFC to see the genuineness and authenticity of the will. The doctor, while doing that, will also inform all the close relatives of the executor, the nature of the illness and the availability of the medical care and consequences of the treatment or withdrawal of the treatment. The consent of the executor, the person who was named in the advance directive, that whether that because he needs to give permission whether these instructions are to be followed or not. So that consent of that executor is obtained at this stage. The next stage is that the hospital will constitute a medical board of experts from all these different streams. So general medicine, cardiology, neurology, nephrology, psychiatry, and oncology. So you will have 7 doctors sitting on the medical board to examine the patient and give a preliminary opinion whether the instructions in the advance directive are to be followed or not followed. Now let us say that there is a positive opinion given that they need to be followed. Then this decision of the medical board constituted by the hospital has to be communicated to the jurisdictional collector. Collector will constitute one more board with the chief medical officer of the district and 3 expert doctors who will again form an independent opinion. Now these 3 doctors are not the doctors from the hospital board. So now there is a second opinion which will come in, which will say yes or no to following the directions or the instructions laid down in the AD. After this board says okay, after carrying out due diligence, this opinion is presented back to the JMFC. The JMFC court has to go and visit the patient in the hospital to ascertain that all the aspects of whatever has been stated in the opinion have been followed or not, and all the surrounding circumstances of the advance directive and the patient, etc. So this physical visit is very important in this process. After that is done, the JMFC will then authorize the implementation of the decision of the board, which is based on what is written in the advance directive. What happens if the medical board constituted by the jurisdictional collector rejects the decision of the hospital medical board? Then the executor, near relative, or anyone from the hospital can file a writ under 226. This Chief Justice has to constitute a division bench to grant approval or authorize. The High Court also may constitute a separate medical board to see the validity of the opinion, the validity of the advance directive, all of that. In a way, a very complex procedure involving lot many people, but what best the Supreme Court is trying to do here is to ensure that from all sides, the person's life is protected to the extent that even when the life is taken away, that is done only and only in accordance with the desire expressed by the patient or the person making the advance directive, being validated by 2 independent medical boards, and only then the decision of, say, stoppage of life support treatment is then taken. All right, so I guess this is how detailed I have given the procedure in this presentation. In my career, till now, we have not filed any application for implementation of the medical directives or the advanced medical directives. All we have done till now is register the same with the jurisdictional JMFC and get the counter signature, trying our best to ensure the essence of the judgment is followed while preparation of the draft, and the essence is followed when the JMFC, where we help or we assist the JMFC to come to a decision whether the advance directive has been prepared as per the guidelines laid down in the judgment or not. The guidelines which I have reproduced in this presentation have been given in different words. I've tried to simplify it in different words in the judgment itself. And just for the sake of clarity, the procedure starts from the detailed procedure is given in para 190 and 191, starting from page 60 of the judgment onwards, going for about 6-7 pages from there. So I hope I've been able to bring about clarity about how the advance directive is to be prepared, not only prepared, but then filed before the JMFC for recording, preservation, and eventually implementation. Thank you very much. If there are any questions,
I had one question. If anybody wants to go before me, does anybody have any questions for ma'am? Ma'am, I wanted to ask you, is there a specific time period, for the boards to decide on, come to their decision? Because somebody's terminally ill or it's life threatening, there has to be a time frame, right? It can't go on for months or even. So has there been anything on that?
Sudisha, I think very valid. And since all our practicing lawyers, we know exactly what Sudisha means when is there a timeline, especially in view of the very delicate subject that advanced directives deal with. So across the decision, the wordings that has been used is as expeditiously as possible, keeping in mind that the patient is on life support. Is that what has been used? Number of days, number of months obviously has not been stated, because it has to be as soon as possible. It could be, maybe it could be just even 24 hours, 48 hours. It should be as soon as possible. So that's not really stated, but as expeditiously as possible.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Does anybody have any other question? And then otherwise we can wrap up the session. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for taking out the time today. We really enjoyed. It was a really wonderful session. And yes.
Thank you, Sudisha. It's been a pleasure. I have been reading this judgment for a number of days now, and I urge all of you, those who are with me now, those who may look at the recording later, even as a law student, do read through the judgment, because the courts have referred to so many other judgments, also how this subject of right to life and the right of death has been analyzed historically over a period of time, how other countries have looked at euthanasia, passive euthanasia, and it's an absolute delight to read through the judgment. I mean, the language that is being used, the way the analysis has been put across, it's a delight for any law student. So I really urge all of you to go through it whenever you get time to read like a storybook, actually.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.